We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health. 100,000 Nova Scotians are without a family doctor, Mr. Speaker. They heard their Premier promise that they would all get one. They certainly did not expect a government that would make things worse. Today we learned that the doctors of Nova Scotia have taken to the courts to sue this government for breach of contract. I would like to ask the Minister of Health, how can Nova Scotians trust this government with their health care when he keeps making things worse?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I believe the circumstances here is very clear, Mr. Speaker. The concerns being raised by Doctors Nova Scotia relate to benefit payments. I'd like to make it very clear that we value the role that physicians play in this province. We believe they are deserving of the benefits identified in the Master Agreement. We continue to make those payments, Mr. Speaker, and that's what's very clear is that Nova Scotia has made the payments for the benefits that are afforded to physicians across this province, and we'll continue to honour those commitments. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the circumstances here are very clear. This government put its signature on a master agreement with doctors in 2016, and then they reneged on that very same agreement in 2017, Mr. Speaker. It's as simple as that. When there are so many Nova Scotia families looking to recruit doctors to this province, this government went out of its way to make things worse. That is what happened, Mr. Speaker. And it came up in the election, and the Premier met with the doctors of Nova Scotia in May during the election, and it was brought to his attention then, Mr. Speaker, that there had been a breach of the contract, and yet the government did nothing. So I would like to ask the Minister of Health, why did this government sign a contract with doctors that it had no intention of honouring?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have every intention of honouring the contract, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, we are of the opinion that we are honouring that contract. As I've already mentioned, we recognise the importance of the payments for benefits for physicians. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to bring to the House's attention the fact that it's this government of Nova Scotia that went above and beyond our contractual obligations through the negotiating period in between the current and the previous master agreement, Mr. Speaker. We continue to pay benefits for physicians through that process because we recognize that that was an important role, and our physicians deserve those benefit payments, and we'll continue to honour those commitments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if this government's signature meant anything with the doctors of Nova Scotia, they would not be being sued today for breaching the contract. Nova Scotians expect you to work this out, not to bring such petty details to the courts. Listen to the minister, Mr. Speaker, talking about funds of a few $1 million when there are 100,000 families without a doctor. Everyone else works it out. The government's never been sued by the doctors before, Mr. Speaker. Only under this government are they being sued. Every minute they spend on that lawsuit is a minute not spent recruiting more doctors, Mr. Speaker. So I will ask the minister, when the healthcare needs of Nova Scotia families are so great, why is this government going out of its way to make it harder to recruit doctors to Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, the member opposite, the Leader of the Official Opposition, may think over $4 million is not worth taking care and control over for the people of Nova Scotia.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
But I believe Nova Scotians would think differently. In fact, the provisions of the...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Master Agreement does provide provisions, Mr. Speaker, to have the auditors go in and take a look to see what, if any, amount should be held in reserve in a third party of Doctors Nova Scotia. That would be taxpayers' money paid in advance, held in a surplus account, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. If I have to call order again, the Honourable Member for Pictou East. We'll deal with it. The Honourable Minister of Health.
So as I was saying, Mr. Speaker, that we remain the member opposite the Leader of the Opposition. I share his opinion that we continue to work through these issues rather than going through the courts. My door's been open, Mr. Speaker, as has the department and the auditors from the internal audit group, Mr. Speaker, to address the concerns that are outstanding with Doctors Nova Scotia. We look forward to continuing those discussions to work through these concerns without going through the courts. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to direct my question to the Minister of Environment. The minister's decision over the summer to allow tyres to be burnt for fuel by the major multinational Lafarge instead of being recycled here in Nova Scotia by a local business has in Colchester County been met with outrage and disbelief and in fact I think contempt. And so I want to ask the minister, how can he possibly defend his decision to allow a company to burn tyres instead of ensuring that these tyres are recycled here in our own province?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member for the question. What I can say is Divert Nova Scotia awarded a competitive tender where the majority of tyres will continue to be used for tyre-derived aggregate. 25% will go to Lafarge for tyre-derived fuel. This is common practice across the world and in fact in some of the provinces in Quebec and British Columbia. I gave that approval for the environmental assessment for a one-year pilot study to verify the results that came from the evidence provided in that application. They have not yet applied for the industrial approval for the one-year pilot study, but when they do, we will make that decision based on the science and evidence in that application. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister makes it appear as though the burning of tyres for fuel is a widely, unanimously accepted practice. In fact, it's a highly contentious practice, and there are jurisdictions in Canada which entirely don't allow it. And that's why, ever since this announcement was made this summer, residents of South Colchester have held community meetings, they have written letters to the media, they have initiated just currently a judicial review. In light of all this resistance there has been to the minister's announcement, one can't help but wonder who, in fact, the minister was consulting with in coming to this decision. So I want to ask the minister, is he satisfied with the level of consultation that's been undertaken by his department prior to the decision to permit the burning of tyres for fuel in Pleasant Valley?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's be clear. The evidence in the application shows that there will be reductions in overall emissions with tyre-derived fuel. There's 30% reductions in carbon, 15% reductions in nitrogen. There's a pilot study that's on the table. They have to apply for that industrial approval. We'll be watching that closely with strict conditions that came from the public submissions, the 30-day period for public submissions, which I personally read through. I expect that the evidence in that application will be verified with that pilot study, and then we can move forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Once again, Mr. Speaker, the minister speaks as though this were an entirely established matter, whereas in fact, whether or not greenhouse gases are reduced by this measure is highly contended over, and there is a very considerable body of opinion which suggests that the amount of quarrying that will be required to replace the TDA from recycling will have in fact more greenhouse gas emissions. But we on our side of the House have been very concerned about the lack of consultation, and that's one of the reasons why we introduced not long ago an environmental bill of rights to ensure there would be more consultations in situations like this. So I ask the minister, is he willing to stand with the growing body of people in Nova Scotia who are concerned about places of inadequate environmental consultation, and is he willing to stand with them to support the passage in Nova Scotia for our people of an environmental bill of rights?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, the Department of Environment has to continue to look at the evidence that's provided in the application. In this case, there was external evidence provided. Our internal experts within the department and our public health officers had offered the information to me. I had to evaluate that information, as did other jurisdictions in Quebec and British Columbia. They do it in California, which has very strict air emission consultations.
Please. The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
They do it across, as I said, and all over
Order,
Europe.
Please. If I have to speak to the Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River again. The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Again, I can go through the list where this is successful across the world. I've heard the member opposite mention the Scandinavian countries many times in this House. They do this tire-derived fuel practice there in Finland and Germany and all over the world. What's important, though, is that the parameters in the operation are there, and we're monitoring it, and it will be minute by minute by an independent body, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to continue to make decisions based on the evidence and the science, not based on emotion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health. Earlier this week on CBC Radio, independent healthcare expert Mary Jane Hampton stated that Nova Scotia is getting a reputation as a bad place to practice medicine. No wonder when we've reached a point where the doctors of Nova Scotia have to sue their own government to honour its signature on their contract, Mr. Speaker. This is a serious situation. The reputation of the government is at risk. 100,000 Nova Scotians who want a doctor see the connection from the way this government acts and the fact that they don't have a family doctor. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, will he admit that the actions of his government dishonouring its own contract with doctors is making doctor recruitment harder in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe you would rule the member's position there a dispute of fact, Mr. Speaker, in the fact that I maintain that we continue to honour our agreement and the master agreement with Doctors Nova Scotia. Indeed, as I've said previously, we continue to ensure that all benefit payments continue for physicians across this province. Mr. Speaker, we believe that those payments to physicians for their benefits through Doctors Nova Scotia is an important part of the services they provide and the compensation for that important work. Mr. Speaker, we continue to take steps in this budget to invest in collaborative practices, to expand our residency program, to attract more physicians to Nova Scotia to improve the primary care services for all Nova Scotians. So indeed, Mr. Speaker, we do care.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, you do not look after the healthcare needs of Nova Scotians by breaking your word to the doctors of Nova Scotia. That is the problem today. Now the doctors are suing the government because they want them to honour the signature that this government put on the master agreement with our doctors, Mr. Speaker. That is unprecedented. I want to say this again, Mr. Speaker, very carefully. The reputation of the government as an honest broker in its dealings with doctors is in dispute now before the courts. That is wrong when so many families need a doctor in the province, Mr. Speaker. They want the government working on their needs, not on these disputes, Mr. Speaker. So if the minister truly wants to fix this situation, will he commit to honouring the master agreement with the doctors of Nova Scotia and end this latest debacle before real harm is done to our healthcare system?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, the Leader of the Opposition referenced a CBC interview with consultant Mary Jane Hampton, Mr. Speaker. I believe in that interview, the reference that she made in terms of the issues there actually had much to do about airing our dirty laundry in public, Mr. Speaker. So I think the member opposite in his comment.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
So I think
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
So I think the member opposite, Mr. Speaker, if he paid attention to that entire interview and the recommendations being made there, he may consider his approach to dealing with this situation. Again, we continue to honour our agreement. We recognise the importance of the benefit payments and indeed have gone above and beyond our requirements under the previous bargaining master agreement to provide benefit payments, even while the contract had expired, and there's no obligation for us to do that, Mr. Speaker. We very clearly take the benefit payments of physicians seriously. We'll continue to honour those commitments. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to continue this line of questioning about the lawsuit against the province from Doctors of Nova Scotia, about which we learned earlier this morning. In connection with this, the chair of Doctors Nova Scotia says publicly that the atmosphere of trust between doctors and the province is at risk. In my judgment, the responses that the Minister of Health has given about this to this point are somewhat glib, and so I wish to ask the Minister, is he not alarmed, as we are on this side of the House, by the damage that has been done here to the province's relationship with our doctors?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to clarify for the member opposite, the Leader of the NDP, Mr. Speaker, that indeed the situation here, I want to clarify the role of Doctors Nova Scotia and the physicians. Again, our obligations to ensure that the payments and the benefits are provided to physicians throughout this province continue to be honoured. In terms of the concerns being raised by the organizations Doctors Nova Scotia pertaining to the establishment and maintaining a surplus fund of taxpayer money within that organization. A process was established in the master agreement to have auditors review that process and come up with recommendations. Those auditors are continuing those meetings and look forward to the recommendations so that we can move forward on this. And we continue to remain committed to that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, many times here in question period and throughout the budget estimates, we have heard the Minister of Health speak of how he's listening to doctors, how policies are being changed to reflect the concerns of doctors, and how the government is working with doctors. But the lawsuits being spoken of this morning suggest something very different. They suggest, in fact, that the government's approach is deepening the crisis we face in healthcare. And so, Mr. Speaker, on this day when we have learnt that the doctors of Nova Scotia are anticipating suing the province of Nova Scotia, I want to ask the Minister what I have several times asked the Premier before. Will the Minister acknowledge that there is a health care crisis in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, we continue to invest in primary care services. This budget that's being debated through estimates, Mr. Speaker, outlines a number of investments in important areas, including primary care and improving wait times for surgeries, Mr. Speaker. These are important services that Nova Scotians believe that they want to see moving forward in our healthcare system. I believe that's far more important, Mr. Speaker, than having $4.4 million held in a third party of taxpayers' money in a third party's bank account, Mr. Speaker. But we remain committed to the master agreement that when the auditors come back and to say what, if any, surplus should be held of taxpayers' money, that we would honour that establishment. To date, the auditors are continuing those meetings and look forward to receiving the recommendations. Thank you.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, late last week, 13 mills working with West4 received notice that their timber lease was up for renewal and would only be extended for 30 days. You can only imagine the shock and concern this posed to mills who employ thousands of Nova Scotians in rural Nova Scotia. After the mill owners met with the minister advised the agreement would be extended for 6 months, but Mr. Speaker, it came with a catch. There has been a reduction in allocation and elimination of unused allocation. This has serious impacts to mill operations in Nova Scotia. Does the minister think that catching industry off guard with a surprise reduction is any ways to do business in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the honourable member for the question. Certainly, I think we are all aware in this House that part of the campaign promise was that there would be no more long-term commitments for mills until after there was a forestry review. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, the forestry review could not be completed and won't be ready until the end of February. But we are standing by our word. There are no long-term commitments. The mills were aware of that. West4 was aware of that. And West4...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of the Environment. I would really respectfully ask the members of the opposition parties to respect the chair. You may not agree with what you're hearing, but please respect the chair. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The mills have all been aware that there were no more long-term leases until after the forestry review would be completed. To that end, the review, and they knew exactly when the expiry time was coming up and when it would come. Certainly, they were not aware of the conditions of continuing with the new agreement, but I certainly, and since that is a contractual thing that hasn't been addressed yet, I don't want to talk about the details of the contract.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, just because you can't get your work done, does that mean you're going to handcuff the mills in Nova Scotia?
Please. I'd like to remind the Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne not to refer to members opposite directly. The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Apologies. My apologies. Mr. Speaker, one of these mills is in my constituency, Freeman's Lumber Mill, and they employ over 150 people. The owners are telling me this decision will result in the loss of their biggest white pine customer and layoffs. Would the minister be prepared to visit my constituency and sit with these 150 families and tell them what the future holds for them?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And better than that, I actually met with Mr. Freeman yesterday and discussed his challenges. You know, Currently, I mean, the contract is still being discussed. It hasn't been finalized. We were trying to find the right balance, Mr. Speaker. All members of this House have heard about challenges in the West with lumber harvesting and what was happening in the practices. There were many questions. That's why we ordered the review. We will be living up to our commitment. There will be we'll be looking forward to the recommendation from Professor Leahy at the end of February and be moving forward with specific items.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, last Friday, a large private daycare centre in Eastern Passage closed suddenly, leaving the parents of over 50 preschool children, several with special needs, and 30 after-school program participants without any care for their children. We have 13 staff who are suddenly unemployed. A new operator who has worked there has contacted the Department of Community Services and the Department of Education because she'd like to open up a new daycare starting as early as tomorrow. She was told that there would be a 3 to 6 month wait to obtain a license to do so. In the meantime, these families are left with no care. My question, Mr. Speaker, is will the Minister advise us how long it typically takes to get approval to start a daycare centre and get a license, as well as to offer subsidized daycare spots? And can his department expedite this on an urgent basis to give them their license now?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do appreciate that question and the concern that's been created in that community with the closure of this facility. Our staff have already reached out to current license holders, Mr. Speaker, to see if they are actually able to fill that void immediately. So our staff is working on this diligently to make sure that families and our children in that member's area do have this service as quickly as possible.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that response, but the majority of the parents who are calling the alternate locations are not being given subsidized daycare spots, so they can't afford to go to those spots. So the question now is, there's a potential new owner who has advised us that she has purchased 510 of the 1,000 shares of the incorporation that had the license, so they want to keep the license and continue with the same grant funding and subsidies that they were given originally. It's all the same staff, so we're not sure why there would be a delay, because it's not bringing in a bunch of new people. But they were advised that if they required a new license, that they're not eligible for funding. So they're actually at a location right at this exact minute, so they could possibly have a spot to start tomorrow. So again, I asked the minister if they could not expedite a license and grant them their continued funding so that they can get back tomorrow. Thanks.
The Honourable Minister of Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do want to assure the member that staff have reached out to a number of current licensee holders to see if they're able to provide a service in that community, because we share that members' stress over this issue. We want to make sure that our families have access to these critical services, and we will continue to work with our partners in the private sector to make that happen as quickly as possible.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are disappointed with the expense scandal at the IWK. There have been vacancies on the IWK Board of Directors since 2014. The missing directors are the Nova Scotia government's representatives on the board. Last week, the Standing Committee on Human Resources convened for the first time since the election, and the job there is to review appointments to agencies, boards, and commissions. There were no appointments to the Board of Directors for the IWK. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Health is, why is the government, the Department of Health, not ensured there was a full Board of Directors for the IWK that would lead to ensure proper management of the IWK Board?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to assure you and the member opposite, indeed all members of the Legislature and all Nova Scotians, that I do have every confidence in the board at the IWK and their handling of this situation, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the outstanding positions on the IWK board, I've spoken to this publicly, indicated that with the fall advertising, I would be considering all applications to take Mr. Speaker, this opportunity to encourage the member. She knows qualified individuals to look at the ABCs. Went out just a couple of weeks ago. Encourage them to apply for the position. I thought it was more prudent to go through this fall review in light of circumstances that took place since the last consideration to find appropriate candidates. So we'll go through that process. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, the two vacancies have been there since 2014. There's actually been 33 different opportunities, different meetings to appoint the two directors that represent the government. Now we are seeing, you can't deny, we are seeing governance problems with the IWK Board of Directors. Why has the government failed to live up to the obligations to having these two directors representing government on the IWK board?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I would want to assure the member opposite, and indeed all members of the Legislature and all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, is that the board currently has 19 active members on that board, Mr. Speaker, overseeing the operations of the executive there, Mr. Speaker. As the questioning started with reference to the concerns of the executive expenses at this institution, Mr. Speaker, remain confident that the board chair and the board have taken the appropriate steps to engage the Auditor General, a third-party accounting firm, to review those expenses, and indeed even passed the information on to the police. I think all steps that Nova Scotians would expect in a situation like this. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, on Friday, the South Shore Regional School Board issued a request for proposals for the on-site provision of pre-primary after-school program services. Site visits for intended providers, put out Friday, are scheduled for 10:30 a.m. and 2 p.m. today, times when most childcare providers would obviously be busy with the children in their care. And proposals are due October 11th. Mr. Speaker, we began raising concerns about the need for wraparound care for pre-primary programs months ago, but again, the government has dropped the ball in implementation. Mr. Speaker, I understand the role of school boards here, but my question for the Minister is, does the Minister have concerns that childcare providers have been given less than 2 weeks to develop proposals for providing wraparound care?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is, of course, key to having a full and complete childcare sector in our province that includes universally free pre-primary care for 4-year-olds. This is going to be a key question in the consultation that we will begin by the end of this month with the sector, Mr. Speaker. I intend, based on the feedback I've had actually from the sector, that this consultation will yield some very positive results for the sector and create some really important labour market information that they'll be able to use for their own benefit.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
With respect, Mr. Speaker, my question was not about consultation. The Daycare Act and regulations are in place to protect the safety and well-being of children in regulated care and to cover the work and environment of regulated daycares. This RFP that I am asking about states that the school board is looking for a licensed provider. Licensed providers under the Act are required to operate within its provisions, and as we just heard from my colleague, that process can take 3 to 6 months. We know, however, that pre-primary classrooms will not be licensed under the Daycare Act and are currently not subject to any regulations, Mr. Speaker. So will the Minister confirm that this RFP is asking licensed childcare providers to operate outside of the Daycare Act?
The Honourable Minister of Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the member knows, we've brought forward the Pre-Primary Act in this House. That will be the legislative framework that we will be operating the pre-primary program under, Mr. Speaker. And as she stated, it is correct, that is separate from the Daycare Act.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, there's several emergency departments that have been closed around this province. For example, this past weekend, Spring Hill was closed, Tatamagouche, Glace Bay, New Waterford, Pugwash, also blood collection in Barrington. More than a year ago, the government announced a change in the locum program for physicians. I was very disappointed this weekend to go on the NSHA website under physician opportunities to see if I was a physician looking for work, what would I see? The locum section was not updated. In fact, the postings on there for physicians were from March, and there were 0 postings for current openings. Will the Minister of Health address this serious mismanagement by the Nova Scotia Health Authority?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Indeed, you know, in communities that have their emergency departments not open 24/7, and the concerns they have there and the service provided, I want to remind Mr. Speaker that we do have for the critical emergency situations a top-notch EHS program. We continue to work through the Nova Scotia Health Authority to fill the vacancies, to ensure they have staffing in place, whether they be permanent staff in the community to provide those services, or locum positions, which would be staff that come in to the communities to provide those services. So those efforts and that work continues across the province where appropriate, Mr. Speaker. I know as part of my tour I did speak to individuals who actually prefer to work on a locum basis and going to different communities to provide the services. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, perhaps the Minister didn't understand my question. The question was, the website that advertises to physicians what opportunities are available in this province has not been updated since March. It is that outdated. When is he going to address the mismanagement by the leadership of this health authority?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. I think the member opposite would know full well that the NSHA continues to recruit physicians and primary care providers right across this province, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, the leader of the official opposition even tabled, I think, on the first day of the Legislature, about 150 job postings for physicians across the province, Mr. Speaker. So, again, those efforts and the work continues, not just by the NSHA, but indeed communities across this province to recruit physicians and primary care providers to our communities, because we all know Nova Scotia is a fantastic place to come and work, despite the negative concerns faced by the opposition parties, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for WCB. Mr. Speaker, the very wording of the Workers' Compensation Act of Nova Scotia, Section 167, is entitled Immunity from Suit. In this section of the Act, any person remotely connected to the investigation through to the hearing and appeals process falls under this section. Over time, this immunity from suit has translated into agents, employees, or representatives of WCB not being accountable for their actions while on duty to the WCB. My question to the Minister, is the Minister aware that when agents, employees, or representatives of a service or organization are not held accountable for their actions while in duty or employment of said services or organizations, that unacceptable practices can become commonplace?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. The way the question was phrased was a bit in a general area, but I will say that I would expect that all workers' compensation employees would be abiding by the Act that overrules them, and you know, I would expect that they are not engaged in any activities or any type of work activities that are not under that Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my constituency office has witnessed many incidents of caseworkers with no reportable medical, education, or practical experience, completely disregarding or dismissing medical evidence having been made by medical specialists. In many cases, evidence consisting of several medical appointments supporting the injured worker's position. My question to the Minister, does the Minister recognize that when unqualified personnel disregard or totally dismiss professionally provided evidence with respect to ongoing WCB cases, would this not place the individual outside anything that could be considered good faith?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I'm familiar with the case the Honourable Member is speaking about. He has spoken to me in regards to it, and I have asked staff to look into that situation. There is within Workers' Compensation Board medical professionals, and you know, we also have medical professionals out in Nova Scotia. And I would, myself not being a medical professional, I would rely on the expert testimony of those medical professionals to actually come to the conclusion as to whether the individual worker is capable of going back to work, a partial type of work, or if that individual does require workers' compensation benefits for a short period of time or a long period of time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for WCB. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to have all members of this House aware of this situation. I've never been so disappointed and disgusted with WCB caseworkers following numerous attempts, including tribunals, to assist an injured constituent. Daryl McKinnon slipped and fell at his place of employment, injuring himself on February 13, 2012. Mr. McKinnon has been examined by more than one specialist in Halifax who have rendered very convincing reports in his favour. However, it has been quite obvious to us that the goal of the WCB is to have Mr. McKinnon examined by other doctors in order to grab some piece of medical information that they think might allow them to deny his rights. My question to the Minister, I'm wondering if the Minister will agree with me that what is happening to this 53-year-old Nova Scotian is simply morally wrong.
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. The member has spoken to me in regards to the case, and I have asked the department to engage WCB to actually look into that specific case. My hope, as is the hope of all members in this legislature and in Nova Scotia, that if there's an individual that can't perform their job duties and that's a result of a workplace accident, that WCB is there to support them, and that is what WCB is there for, is to actually support our individual workers when they can't work in terms of insurance and covering their pay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, that's the problem. WCB are not always there for the injured workers. Mr. Speaker, the facts of this case are simple and straightforward. Prior to his fall, Mr. McKinnon had absolutely no issues with his balance, tremors, or muscle weakness. In fact, he loved his work and his employment record was impeccable. MRIs and extensive blood work and several visits to well-known neurologists in Halifax proved that his problem with his gait and dexterity were caused by his fall. The WCB sent Mr. McKinnon to a doctor that handles numerous cases for their organization, in other words, not exactly independent. The hearing officer agrees with this third party, ignoring the first two findings and recommendations of two independent neurologists. My question to the Minister, someone in government has to step up to the plate. I'm asking the Minister or any member on the government side to right a wrong and help this very polite, mannerly and honest man. It is simply criminal what the CB are doing to him. He's lost his life savings and is becoming desperate because he can no longer work due to his injury.
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, as I stated earlier before, the member has brought that case to my attention, and I told the member in discussions with him that I would definitely have our staff at LAE look into it and engage workers' compensation. I'll go a step further and say that if in these discussions we find that there could be an area where the gentleman's been treated unfairly, I will ask the department to request from WCB to engage a third-party doctor and have somebody independent review the case file. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of the Environment. To comply with their operating terms and conditions, Northern Pulp established a community liaison committee that's supposed to provide an opportunity for community members to voice their perspectives on the company's operations. But many Pictou County residents are questioning the effectiveness of this committee. So I'd like to ask the Minister, does he think that Northern Pulp's community liaison committee has allowed for effective community input into decisions that will affect their environment and the health of their families?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member opposite for the question. I've recently met with a group in the Pictou area, the Clean the Mill group. They brought this very concern to my attention, and staff are reviewing it. Usually there is constant communication between the Community Liaison Committee and the residents surrounding the community. If the quality of that connection is not there, then we will make a change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad to hear that response. We also met with them yesterday, but community members want to be provided with some level of assurance that any plan to replace the Boat Harbour treatment facility is actually reviewed by someone other than government officials in Northern Pulp. The Minister has the power to make that happen. Pursuant to the Environment Act, the Minister has the power to refer a Class 1 environmental assessment to a review panel. This review could help increase transparency and accountability in the decision-making process. So my question to the Minister, will he commit today on the floor of this House to referring the environmental assessment report for replacing the Boat Harbour treatment facility to an independent review panel for public discussion?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for that question as well. The Class 1 environmental assessment has to do with when an industrial site makes a modification. In this case, the Northern Pulp Mill is asking for a modification by way of an effluent treatment facility. We've deemed that a Class 1. One of the things the ministers can do when they receive information is, if they're not satisfied with that information, is to ask for additional information. So there actually is more flexibility. And again, going back to any approval process, we look at the science and evidence provided in the application, and that's what we're prepared to do. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, my constituent and lifelong friend Donald Blennis was ill and near death a year ago when he discovered he had Lyme disease and started going to Maine for treatment. He states that treatment saved his life. He states, all the antibiotics I get in the States are legal here. The catch is I have to take 8 twice a day for 3 or 4 years, he said, noting that this long-term treatment method is not prescribed by doctors here in Nova Scotia, and I will table that. My question for the Minister is, will Donald Blennis and hundreds of other Nova Scotians like him, when will they be able to get the treatment they need here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for bringing this important question about Lyme disease to the floor of the Legislature. I'd like to remind the member, I believe my colleague, the Minister of Community Services, has often been referred to as a strong advocate in even predating my time here in the Legislature for Lyme disease. Mr. Speaker, the conditions and the treatment of Lyme disease in the province of Nova Scotia adhere to the recommendations of research that's done by clinicians. The physicians in the community and the Public Health Office assures me that the processes that are followed in this province do adhere to those national guidelines. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this year, Donald Blennis had his antibiotics seized at the Canadian border by Canada Border Services for no other reason than this was a prescription acquired in the United States. He's in a catch-22. The drugs are legal here, but the life-saving U.S. treatment protocol is not permitted here. No Canadian doctor can prescribe the treatment for fear of losing their license. The Canadian federal government no longer allows prescription drugs to cross the border. Mr. Speaker, caught in this treatment limbo, what does the Health Minister suggest that Donald Blennis and hundreds of other Nova Scotians like him with Lyme disease do?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again for this important question and topic. Again, I assure the member opposite that the protocols and the approach by which physicians in the province of Nova Scotia adhere to the national guidelines and practices for this and other treatments, Mr. Speaker, follow those practices. Those practices are developed by the clinicians, the clinical reviews, Mr. Speaker. I trust the member opposite would agree with me that deferring to the clinical expertise of our frontline healthcare professionals and the physicians is the appropriate course of action in treatment. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of the Environment. I'd like to follow up on my colleague's question about the Minister has the ability to constitute a review panel to look at the application for the new treatment, new effluent treatment plan. I'd like to ask the Minister, is the Minister considering constituting an independent review panel to look at that application when it comes before him?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can appreciate the question from the members opposite. It's a very important project, and again, it was deemed a Class 1 environmental assessment because of the pulp mill asking for a modification to the mill by way of the effluent treatment facility that they intend to create into Pictou County. it is important that we listen to the submissions during the process of the public consultation process, so there's a 30-day period, and again, there is more flexibility within the minister to ask for additional information if they're not satisfied. So I will be looking at all the information that comes in and make a decision corresponding with that. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I didn't hear an answer on the very specific question about the review panel. I don't want to imply too much from the minister's answer, but it seems like he's implying that at the end of the 30-day period, he could look at the minister could review the information that comes in, and then at that time determine, hey, I would like an independent review panel to help me review it. If that's the minister's position, that he could constitute the review panel at the end of 30 days, I'd just like to know that. If he could constitute it at the beginning, I'd like to know that as well. I'd just like to know that the people of Nova Scotia and indeed the people of Pictou County can have some assurance that there could be an independent review panel reviewing the application. It's well within the minister's means, and I just want to make sure he exercises everything that is within his means.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
What I can tell the member opposite and all members in this House is I will look at the decisions based on what's in the Environment Act, and in the Environment Act, when there's a modification to an existing industrial site, it's a Class 1 that does not include the independent panel. I've met with the Clean the Mill group. This is one of the items that they brought up to my attention, so I've spoken to staff in terms of what we can do to ensure that we do have two-way communication with the community throughout the process. But again, we will look at the science and evidence based in the whole process, from our internal experts, from the experts from the Department of Fisheries, and from the Department of Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as the public submissions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. Once again, we're back here for another session in the House, and once again, there are serious questions about what the government is doing to attract and retain doctors. Polling released recently confirms that 13% of Nova Scotians are now without a family doctor, and that's up from 9% when this government first took office. And Mr. Speaker, I'll table that. Across from us sits a government that spoke at length about doctor recruitment during the election campaign, but has spent this summer silent, Mr. Speaker, on the matter. My question to the Minister is, will the Minister of Health and Wellness admit that his department isn't getting the job done when it comes to recruiting and retaining doctors in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for this question. Obviously, access to primary care services, primary health care services to the people of Nova Scotia is a very important, timely topic, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, this government's commitment to recruitment and creating an environment that is conducive to attracting primary health care professionals, to encourage them to set up in our communities across the province, continue this budget that's before the Estimates Committee, Mr. Speaker, shows investments in collaborative care practices, a new way that physicians and frontline healthcare providers practice, as well as other initiatives that we believe will assist us in expanding primary care access.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Doctors Nova Scotia has published a new report entitled Healing Nova Scotia: Recommendations for our Thriving Physician Workforce, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this report points to poor doctor recruitment efforts and the danger of taking local communities out of recruitment, which has largely been the case since the NSHAA was established. Despite years of promises, nothing has happened. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Health and Wellness accept the recommendations of Doctors Nova Scotia to help turn around doctor recruitment? The crisis in the province of Nova Scotia is getting worse, and this government is sitting in their glass towers and doing nothing about it.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. I do fundamentally, however, have to disagree with the premise of the question he's putting forward, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
The suggestions being made, Mr. Speaker, I believe are fundamentally factually inaccurate. This government and the NSHA have been taking steps, Mr. Speaker, to improve recruitment. Indeed, shown commitment to adjust the plans that they put forward. For example, I've used previously the notion of collaborative care practices. Early on, the intention was to have a cookie-cutter approach, a fixed structure and configuration of employees providing those collaborative practice services. We learned that wasn't the appropriate path, that it wasn't going to work for physicians and primary.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
And primary care providers, Mr. Speaker, they want flexibility. We provide that flexibility. The same can be said with respect to where physicians practice in the province of Nova Scotia. We're listening and we're creating a better environment for service providers.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday I asked the Minister of Natural Resources why she is allowing a clear cut to take place inside the sanctuary, as it is widely known, the Tobiatic Wildlife Management Area. Can she confirm if she has looked into that matter?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for that question. Certainly, I have looked into the area and know and appreciate certainly what that area has to. So we have in the Tobiatic area and the Kejimkujik area comprises almost 500,000 acres in hectares in Nova Scotia that primarily is wilderness area. There is a small area of that land that is, however, available for harvesting purposes. Now, it's only a small area of that land. Decisions are made on any harvest plans.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.